This morning, the Princess of Wales made her highly anticipated return to the world stage, marking her first international appearance following her courageous health battle. Kate stepped out independently, embarking on an emotional research journey dedicated to a cause near and dear. After thousands of devoted supporters packed the public square, leaning from windows just to catch a glimpse of her meeting her youngest admirers, the scene was set for an immaculate royal display. The landmark coronation anniversary was fully intended to be an exquisite showcase of crown solidarity, flawless protocol, and historical continuity. But one shimmering object instantly shattered the illusion. When Princess Catherine caught sight of Queen Camilla walking out in Princess Diana's iconic tiara, the entire grand hall didn't just fall silent, the air completely froze. Catherine's expression hardened instantly. Sensing the shift, Prince William immediately stepped forward, and within seconds, the historic proceedings were brought to a sudden, stunning halt before the palace could attempt to mask the tension. Before we unmask what this explosive confrontation means for the future of the monarchy, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a royal update. Catherine immobilized, as if hit by an invisible wave. She arrived at the celebration fully prepared to project grace under intense scrutiny, to stand loyally by King Charles, and to anchor William as the institution displayed its curated image of unshakable strength. This milestone anniversary, a high-stakes public celebration of the sovereign's crowning, was meticulously engineered to project absolute stability after months of deep familial distress. Camilla was meant to stand prominently alongside the king as living proof of an enduring palace. Instead, she chose to adorn herself with the single symbol guaranteed to provoke a crisis. In that charged atmosphere, Diana's tiara wasn't just jewelry. It felt like a deliberate provocation, placed exactly where old wounds still bleed. William recognized the flashing warning signs in Catherine before anyone else in the room could comprehend them. The heir to the throne looked at his wife's face, then locked eyes with Camilla, before staring directly at the tiara, his jaw tightening in sheer disbelief. He knew the devastating implications instantly. Diana was never just a name from royal history. She was his mother, his deepest heartbreak, and the focal point of a legacy the palace has spent decades trying to escape. King Charles slowly lowered his ceremonial program, his sudden stillness operating as an unspoken admission. He didn't ask what was wrong, his eyes fixed heavily on the gemstone, and for one agonizing moment, it looked as though he was harboring a dark secret. Camilla attempted to hold her ground. Tilting her chin up, she maintained her rigid posture, waiting for Catherine to be the first to look away. Yet the queen consort's composure visibly fractured under that piercing gaze. This was no petty dispute over royal fashion or hierarchical rank. This was an existential battle over who possesses the right to carry Diana's memory into the modern era, and who had been deliberately sidelined before the damage was unleashed. Catherine did not raise her voice. She did something far more dangerous. She completely refused to participate. A high-ranking royal aide scrambled toward her, whispering urgently in a desperate bid to salvage the strict timetable, but Prince William cut him off with a single commanding hand gesture. The courtier froze in his tracks, instantly realizing this was no longer a temporary delay, it was a full-blown institutional fracture. Charles remained utterly paralyzed between his wife and the future king, while Catherine stood immovable at the center of an escalating disaster the palace apparatus was entirely unequipped to handle. Behind the suffocating silence loomed the one question that threatened to tear the firm apart. Who secretly authorized Diana's tiara or Camilla, and why was Catherine intentionally blindsided? As the formal ceremony dissolved into frantic whispers, the real war played out across the faces of the four royals stranded at the epicenter. In that suspended reality, the crown became raw and human. Catherine was no longer merely the Princess of Wales. She was a woman staring down the memory of Diana placed on another woman's head. William was no longer just the heir. He was a son forced to defend his mother's honor in front of the father who had fundamentally shaped that tragedy. And Camilla stood trapped beneath the suffocating weight of a title she could not truly control. Catherine locked eyes with William before a word was uttered. A single glance conveyed decades of unspoken pain. The title of Princess of Wales, forever etched into the global consciousness by Diana, had never been merely a job description for Kate. It was a sacred vow. It demanded poise under pressure, yes, but it also demanded shielding a legacy that millions still hold holy. William understood that instantly. The prince had spent his entire life watching his mother's memory weaponized, sanitized by official PR, and trotted out whenever the palace required an emotional shield. But this crossed a line. This wasn't a tribute speech. This was Camilla flaunting the tiara directly in front of Diana's son and her successor. Camilla felt the entire room turn hostile before a single word was spoken. The queen consort attempted to project defiance, but her eyes narrowed as she realized Catherine was not going to back down. She had walked into the anniversary believing the historic jewel would signal total public acceptance. Instead, the icy silence pushed her backwards into the very ghosts she has spent a lifetime trying to outlive. Catherine's stillness became an absolute judgment. William's stare transformed into a severe warning. Charles's hesitation signaled imminent danger. Camilla knew the room was now asking the ultimate question. Had she finally crossed a line that royal rank could not protect? Charles desperately tried to calculate the fallout, but his paralysis only worsened the optics. He knew this landmark anniversary was vital to proving his reign had solidified. He also knew Diana's legacy could never be treated like a prop from the palace vaults. Every courtier in the front rows knew the tiara had turned a celebration of unity into an open civil war. Sophie moved quietly to Catherine's side, a subtle movement that completely altered the power dynamic. The trusted confidant didn't intervene or try to manage the princess. She simply stood as an anchor of solidarity. Catherine felt the support, as did William, whose expression shifted from shock into absolute resolve. Camilla saw the alignment and realized she was no longer dealing with an isolated protest. She was facing a united front. Charles finally looked from Catherine to William, then back to Camilla as the tension reached a breaking point. The king hadn't spoken, but his face gave everything away. That tiara had not appeared by accident. Someone had hand-selected it. Someone had signed off on it. Someone had decided Catherine did not deserve a warning. And now the palace had to face the music. To fully comprehend the sheer force of Catherine's fury, the narrative must revisit a highly secretive meeting that made this public clash inevitable. Weeks prior to the anniversary, a definitive warning had already been issued. This was no vague rumor. A specific, closed-door confrontation had already exposed the danger. Catherine explicitly requested that Diana's personal effects never be used as mere palace dressing, particularly not during events designed to smooth over historical wounds. That request was heard, documented, and then, on the day of the anniversary, completely ignored. Catherine had walked into that private briefing room already carrying the anxiety of a brewing betrayal. Clarence House, the longtime power base of Charles and Camilla, served as the quiet setting for the decision that would later rock the monarchy. The meeting was supposed to finalize wardrobe protocols and logistical details, but one specific item changed the temperature in the room.
A tiara explicitly tied to Diana appeared on Camilla's mood board, and Catherine immediately recognized the threat. The princess refused to view it as mere styling preference. She saw it as an opening salvo. Camilla heard Catherine's pushback and felt the underlying challenge to her authority. The queen consort didn't just hear a debate over jewelry, she saw a direct threat to her status beside the king. Catherine argued that Diana's memory must never be used to bolster another woman's public image. William backed his wife completely, telling Charles that symbols carry immense weight because the public does not forget what the palace wishes to erase. Charles listened, but the king failed to shut it down with the authority Catherine expected. That royal silence did the damage. Camilla sat through the remainder of the meeting with her pride deeply wounded, a fact Catherine noted. The queen consort had spent decades trying to forge a path outside of Diana's shadow, yet this single objection dragged that shadow right back into the
Camilla's face contorted. William refused to look away, and Charles suddenly realized his next move would dictate whether this remained a private family wound or exploded into a historic constitutional power struggle. The anniversary ceased to be about celebrating a reign. It was now a raw war for dominance. King Charles had survived decades of intense media scrutiny, personal scandals, and crushing institutional expectations. But this crisis wasn't outside the palace gates. It was standing directly in front of him. Catherine demanded the removal of the stolen legacy. Camilla demanded her royal dignity be preserved. William demanded his mother's honor be defended. Caught between the woman he married and the son who will inherit his throne, Charles had run completely out of safe options. The king assessed the room in silence. Catherine stood her ground, composed but deeply wronged. William watched his father with the cold, hardened stare of a son who had finally reached his absolute limit. Camilla waited for royal intervention, expecting the king to pull rank and shield her from public humiliation. But the monarch knew he couldn't force the ceremony to continue. His sovereign authority to dictate the schedule meant nothing if the family broke apart on live television. If he ordered the march to proceed, Catherine's pain would become a public betrayal. If he stopped it, Camilla's defeat would be broadcast to the world. Charles slowly put down his ceremonial papers. He was no longer hiding behind official protocol. He understood the stakes. Diana's legacy remains the single most explosive emotional fault line between the monarchy and the global public. For William, it wasn't a historical abstract, it was his mother. For Catherine, it was the legacy attached to the massive role she now inhabits. And for Camilla, it was the one eternal shadow her crown could never outshine. Camilla's expression hardened when Charles failed to instantly defend her. The queen consort had expected absolute loyalty, not hesitation. She had stood by him through decades of public exile, and now, when the family turned on her, she required his absolute backing. But Charles looked past his wife's pride and saw catastrophic institutional danger. He saw his heir's boiling anger. He saw Catherine's unyielding stance. He saw that the tiara had turned his anniversary into a definitive test of whether palace silence could still sweep sins under the rug. A senior private secretary stepped forward, cautiously handing over the official wardrobe authorization file. Charles grabbed it with visible anxiety. The top-tier aide didn't need to speak. The document told the entire story. Marked clearly in the margins was Catherine's original objection. Her warning hadn't been lost. It had been logged, read, and deliberately bypassed. Charles stared at the ink, the silence in the room growing heavier than any shouting match. William saw his father's face drop. The prince knew right then this wasn't an administrative mix-up. Catherine saw it too, her pain solidifying into cold certainty. Camilla recognized the shift and realized the official approval she had leaned on was disintegrating. Charles held physical proof that the palace had been warned and that the warning had been treated with contempt. The king's decision came quietly, but it struck like lightning. Charles ordered the anniversary ceremony officially delayed and demanded the four principals retreat to a private holding room. Camilla looked away in fury. Catherine kept her gaze locked. William stayed glued to his wife's side as the king led the way behind closed doors, fully aware that a private family grievance had just escalated into an institutional disaster. Behind those heavy doors, the monarchy's pristine facade shattered completely as the shock waves began leaking through the royal corridors. Outside the room, nobody knew the exact words being exchanged, but everyone understood something irreversible had occurred. Courtiers stopped using the word pause and began whispering the word crisis. Dignitaries checked their devices, footmen stood stranded without orders, and within the royal household, the truth became impossible to suppress. Catherine had forced the crown to answer for what it did to Diana. Camilla exited the private chamber first. Her rigid silence confirmed the worst to the household staff. The queen consort sat completely isolated for several minutes, her hands gripping each other tightly, her face masked in controlled fury, her pride deeply wounded. She had genuinely believed that wearing the tiara would signal her final triumph and total acceptance. Instead, the jewel had acted as a homing beacon for every old scandal she had spent a lifetime trying to bury. The official anniversary program was formally delayed under the vague PR phrase, private royal consultation. The public knew exactly what that meant. Absolute panic. Catherine withdrew alongside Sophie, who refused to offer empty platitudes. The trusted confidant quietly told the princess that while staying silent would have been easier, it would have been a lie. Catherine absorbed the words in silence, fully aware of why her stand mattered. Diana's memory wasn't just family trauma, it was a matter of public trust. If the palace could sneak that symbol onto Camilla without consulting William or Catherine, then every corporate statement about family unity and healing was an absolute sham. Sophie stayed close, acting not as a barrier, but as living proof that Catherine was not standing alone. William received an urgent update while staff were still attempting to manage the fallout. The prince read the secure message once, then read it again, his face turning an icy white. The dispatch confirmed that the decision to override Catherine's objection had traveled much higher up the chain of command than initially reported. William's expression shifted from hot anger to calculated resolve. He had wanted to believe this was a blunder. Now he knew it was a calculated risk. Catherine saw his face and knew the betrayal ran deep. Charles moved ruthlessly to contain the bleeding. He ordered the entire wardrobe file immediately sealed under internal executive review, locking down the papers linked to Camilla's styling choices to be examined by senior crown auditors. That command terrified the staff because it meant the king was hunting for heads, not excuses. Camilla caught wind of the sealed files and went completely rigid. She realized the narrative was no longer about whether Catherine had caused a scene, but rather who had actively conspired to deceive the future queen. William found Catherine before the palace PR team could manufacture their official spin. The prince didn't speak initially. He simply stood as an unyielding wall beside her, sharing the exact same memory, the same fury, and the historic choice forming between them. Catherine looked at him and understood that the next move wouldn't be dictated by courtiers or drafted statements. Before the palace could spin the press, William and Catherine had to decide what this moment meant for Diana's ghost. The most explosive moment of the day occurred in absolute silence, far away from handlers, ceremonies, Camilla, and Charles. William and Catherine stood side by side with zero institutional padding between them. The prince didn't need to ask why she had stopped the march. She didn't need to explain the agony of seeing the tiara. Resting between them was Diana, not as a historical figure, but as a mother whose memory they refused to let the institution exploit again. William looked at his wife, fully aware of the massive institutional target she had just painted on her back. She had halted a state event in front of courtiers trained to weaponize any sign of dissent. They would call her defiant, dramatic, and unstable, but the prince refused to let those narratives enter their space. He told her firmly that defending dignity is not rebellion.
He told her that some moments demand a line in the sand. Catherine heard the profound emotion in his voice, and it anchored her more than any palace protocol ever could. She understood why they couldn't compromise. The modified anniversary schedule could easily resume and pretend the damage was contained. But Diana's legacy could not be treated like a seasonal prop, not after a direct warning had been trampled on. William knew the future of the monarchy would be weighed by how it treats its trauma, not just its power. The future king understood that the public doesn't just watch the gold carriages, they watch to see if real pain is respected. William finally spoke the truth he had carried all day. The tiara had never just been a piece of historic jewelry. It belonged to a raw chapter of his life that the palace PR machine would never be allowed to sanitize or control. Catherine listened intently, her resolve hardening. She had carried her royal role as a duty, but now she saw it as shielding his heart. The prince wasn't just protecting an image, he was protecting his mother from being used in a display that would have broken her spirit. Catherine delivered her non-negotiable terms. The ceremony would only resume under 2 strict conditions. 1, Camilla must completely remove the tiara. 2, an ironclad internal mandate must be signed, dictating that any artifact tied to Diana requires explicit family consent before any future public appearance. Family consent meant that those who actually love Diana's legacy, specifically William and Catherine, hold absolute veto power over her memory. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about absolute protection. William agreed without a single second of hesitation, fully aware of the massive public fallout. If the tiara vanished mid-ceremony, the global press would instantly dissect the absence. If Catherine refused to stand in the official anniversary portraits alongside Camilla while the jewel remained